Left beaten and broken beside a dusty Texas road in 1867, 16-year-old Constance was meant to become just another forgotten casualty of a brutal world until an unlikely savior's carriage stopped, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything their society believed about worth, dignity, and the power of human compassion. But when the town's most powerful men arrive, demanding she be returned to her fate, will the light that refused to die in Constance's spirit be enough to illuminate a path toward freedom? The buzzards circled overhead like black death angels, their shadows dancing across Constance's broken body as she lay twisted beside the old fence post. Blood trickled from her split lip onto the dusty Texas ground, mixing with tears she no longer had the strength to cry. The summer of 1867 had brought no mercy to Cedar Springs, and even less to a 16-year-old girl whose only crime was collapsing from exhaustion in Master Henley's cotton fields. Her ribs screamed with every shallow breath. The overseer's boot had found its mark twice before they'd dragged her to the wagon like a sack of spoiled grain. Worthless! Henley had spat, his tobacco-stained teeth gleaming with satisfaction. Dump her where the town ends. Nature can finish what I started. The wagon wheels had disappeared into the heat waves an hour ago, leaving only the sound of wind through dry grass and the patient wheeze of her own breathing. Constance pressed her cheek against the earth that would soon claim her, feeling the rough texture of dirt and pebbles against her swollen face. Everything her body, her heart, her hope. Mama always said I was special, she thought, remembering gentle hands braiding her hair by candlelight years ago. Said I had a light inside that nobody could put out. But Mama had been sold south 3 winters past, torn away on a morning that froze more than just the water in the wash basin. A red ant crawled across her outstretched fingers, busy with its own small purpose. Even the ant had somewhere to go, someone waiting. Constance watched it navigate around her wedding ring knot from marriage, but carved from a peach pit by her friend Samuel before he'd tried to run north and been caught by the dogs. The ring was all she had left of kindness. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into a furnace that made breathing feel like swallowing fire. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth, thick and useless. In the distance, a mockingbird called out, cycling through the songs of a dozen other birds like it couldn't decide who to be. That's me, Constance realized with bitter clarity, never knowing who I'm supposed to be. She'd tried being the good girl who worked without complaint. She'd tried being invisible, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. She'd even tried being grateful for scraps of mercy that came wrapped in fresh cruelty. Nothing had worked. Nothing had saved her from this moment when the world finally declared her worthless enough to discard. But something deep in her chest, deeper than pain, stronger than fear, refused to accept that verdict. Her fingers curled into the dirt, finding purchase. Her arms trembled as she pushed against the ground, lifting her head just enough to see the road stretching toward town. If I'm gonna die, she decided with a flash of the stubbornness that had kept her reading scraps of newspaper by moonlight, it won't be face down in the dirt. The effort of sitting up sent stars exploding across her vision, but she stayed upright, spine straight despite the agony. Blood from her nose had dried in dark streaks down her chin, and her left eye was swollen, nearly shut. But her right eye blazed with something that looked remarkably like defiance. A dust devil spun across the road, picking up leaves and debris in its miniature tornado. Constance watched it dance, wild and free, before it collapsed back into stillness. Even the wind got to move where it wanted. She touched the peach pit ring on her finger, remembering Samuel's words as he'd placed it there. Promise me something, Constance. Promise you won't let them make you forget who you are inside. I promise, she whispered now to the empty sky. I promise, Samuel. The buzzards above grew bolder, descending in slow circles. One landed on the fence post just feet away, fixing her with a black, intelligent stare. It tilted its head as if surprised to find her still breathing, still fighting. Not yet, she told the bird, her voice a raspy whisper that carried more strength than it had any right to hold. Not today. The buzzard ruffled its feathers and settled in to wait. But something had changed in the balance between predator and prey. Constance might be broken, might be bleeding, might be alone, but she was no longer defeated. A sound drifted on the wind so faint she almost missed it. The distant rhythm of hooves on packed earth, growing steadily closer. Someone was coming down the road from town. The carriage that rounded the bend looked like something from a fairy tale, black as midnight but gleaming like a jewel, with brass fittings that caught the sun and threw it back in golden sparks. The horses pulling it were matched bays with arched necks and flowing manes, their hooves keeping perfect time on the dusty road. This wasn't the rough wagon of a farmer, or the simple buggy of a shopkeeper. This was money with wheels. Mayor Edmund Blackwood sat inside the carriage, his gray suit perfectly pressed despite the heat, reading a letter that had arrived that morning from his doctor in Houston. The words seemed to dance on the page. The consumption has progressed faster than hoped. 6 months, perhaps a year if you're careful. He folded the letter with steady hands, tucking it inside his jacket pocket next to his father's old watch. Time, he thought, watching the familiar landscape roll past. So little time to matter. His driver, a weathered man named Pike who'd worked for the Blackwood family for 20 years, suddenly pulled back on the reins. Whoa there, easy. The carriage lurched to a stop, horses snorting and stamping. What is it, Pike? Blackwood called through the window, irritated at the delay. He had a meeting with the railroad investors in an hour, and they weren't men who appreciated lateness. There's something up ahead, sir. Looks like. Pike's voice trailed off uncertainly. Looks like someone's hurt. Blackwood leaned out the window, shading his eyes against the glare. At first, he saw only the usual roadside debris, tumbleweeds, broken fence posts, the occasional piece of trash blown from town. Then his gaze found her. The girl sat upright against the fence, her dark skin painted with bruises that made his stomach clench. Blood had dried on her face in rust-colored streams, and her dress, once blue, now torn and filthy, hung around her like discarded wrapping paper. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. One was swollen shut, but the other blazed with a fierce intelligence that seemed to look right through him. Drive on, Pike muttered, his hands tight on the reins. Ain't our business, sir. Probably just some runaway got what was coming. But Blackwood couldn't look away. The girl's spine was straight despite obvious pain, her chin lifted with a dignity that had nothing to do with her circumstances. She reminded him of something or someone from long ago. Stop the carriage, he said quietly. Sir? Pike's voice cracked with disbelief. Maybe we should just... I said stop. Blackwood's tone carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed, but his eyes remained fixed on the girl who watched their approach without begging, without cowering, without any of the desperate pleading he might have expected. The carriage wheels settled into silence. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the tall grass, its song bright and clear in the heavy air. Blackwood opened the door and stepped down, his polished boots crunching on the gravelly road surface. Up close, the damage was even worse. Purple bruises bloomed across the girl's cheekbone like poisonous flowers. Her lower lip was split and swollen, and dark stains on her dress suggested wounds hidden beneath the fabric. Someone had beaten her thoroughly, systematically, with the kind of methodical cruelty that came from practice. Dear God, he whispered, kneeling beside her despite Pike's urgent warnings about propriety and what people might say. Child, what happened to you? Constance studied this unexpected visitor, this white man in expensive clothes, who smelled of soap and mint instead of sweat and anger. His face was kind but tired, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the harsh command she'd learned to fear. They said I was worthless, she answered simply, her voice barely above a whisper but clear as mountain water. Said I wasn't worth the food I ate or the space I took up. Blackwood felt something twist deep in his chest. And who decided that? Master Henley, Overseer Jackson, the men who own things. She paused, studying his face with that one blazing eye. Men like you, I suppose. The honesty hit him like a physical blow. She was right, of course. Men like him had built the world that had left her broken beside this road. Men like him had written the laws that made such cruelty not just possible but profitable. What's your name? He asked, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. Constance. She said it with quiet pride, as if the name itself was a small rebellion. Constance. He repeated it, tasting the syllables. Do you have anywhere to go? Anyone who might help you? A shadow passed across her face. No, sir. Nobody left who'd claim me. Pike's voice drifted down from the driver's seat, tight with worry. Sir, we really should be moving along. People will talk if they see us here like this. But Blackwood found himself studying Constance's façon, not just the damage that had been done to it, but the strength that remained beneath. She hadn't asked him for anything, hadn't begged or pleaded or tried to manipulate his sympathy. She'd simply told him the truth and waited to see what he would do with it. The letter in his pocket seemed to whisper, 6 months, perhaps a year. What kind of man do I want to be with the time I have left? Edmund Blackwood, have you lost your mind? Eleanor Blackwood's teacup rattled against its saucer as she stared at her husband across their mahogany dining table. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows on the wallpaper, imported roses from France that had cost more than most families saw in a year. But nothing in their elegant home seemed more out of place than the injured girl now sleeping in their guest bedroom. Lower your voice, Eleanor, Edmund murmured, cutting his roast beef with mechanical precision. She's been through enough without hearing us argue about her existence. 3 days had passed since he'd carried Constance from that dusty roadside, and the town was already buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. The butcher had forgotten their usual order. The postmaster had developed a sudden interest in examining their mail before delivery. Even their longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had requested the week off to visit her sister, a sister nobody knew existed. Eleanor set down her fork with unusual force. The Hendersons crossed the street yesterday rather than speak to me. Martha Jenkins actually turned her back when I entered the mercantile. Do you understand what you've done to our standing in this community? Upstairs, Constance pressed her ear to the guest room door, her heart sinking with each angry word. The room around her felt like a dream, soft blue walls, white lace curtains that filtered sunlight into gentle patterns, a bed with more pillows than she'd ever seen in one place. But dreams always ended, and this one was cracking apart faster than she'd dared hope. I should leave tonight, she thought, touching the fresh bandages Mrs. Blackwood had applied to her ribs that morning, before I ruined them completely. The mayor's wife had been kind but distant, treating Constance's wounds with the same careful attention she might give a wounded bird, necessary but temporary. Eleanor's hands were soft as flower petals, nothing like the calloused palms Constance remembered from her mother. When she spoke, it was in the careful tones of someone performing a duty rather than following her heart. She saved my life. Edmund's voice drifted up through the floorboards. How can you ask me to regret that? I'm asking you to be practical. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Harvey Morrison came by this afternoon. He made it very clear that certain people are concerned about the precedent you're setting. Morrison, Constance knew that name. He owned half the cotton fields in the county and had a reputation for cruelty that made other overseers look gentle. If he was involved, this sanctuary wouldn't last much longer. Down in the dining room, Edmund pushed his plate away, appetite gone. Since when do we let Harvey Morrison dictate our Christian duty? Since he controls half the town council and most of the bank loans that keep this town running, Eleanor's voice turned pleading. Edmund, I know your heart is in the right place, but we have to think about our future, about James. Their son James, studying law back east, carried their hopes for the family name. Every decision they made rippled out to touch his prospects, his marriage opportunities, his place in a world that valued reputation above all else. Constance had heard James mentioned in hushed conversations between the Blackwoods, a golden boy who wrote letters full of big words and bigger dreams. She'd seen his portrait in the parlor, a young man with his father's kind eyes but his mother's determined chin. Even from hundreds of miles away, she was threatening his carefully planned future. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Constance, may I come in? Eleanor entered carrying a tray laden with soup, fresh bread, and a glass of milk that gleamed white as moonlight. She set it on the small table by the window, her movements precise but somehow sad. How are you feeling, dear? Eleanor asked, studying Constance's face with the critical eye of someone checking her work. Better, ma'am. Much better. Constance kept her voice small, grateful. The food is wonderful. The bed is... I never slept on anything so soft. Eleanor's smile flickered like a candle in wind. Good. That's good. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the quilt, her hands restless. Constance, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Here it comes, Constance thought, bracing herself. Do you have any family? Anyone at all who might take you in? An aunt perhaps, or cousins in another town? The question hung between them like smoke. Constance could invent a fictional relative in some distant place. It might buy her time, might postpone the inevitable. But something in Eleanor's face, a desperate hope mixed with genuine concern, made dishonesty impossible. No, ma'am. Nobody left who'd claim me. Eleanor's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. I see. She moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where roses bloomed in careful rows. My husband is a good man, Constance. Perhaps too good for his own welfare. He sees suffering and wants to heal it, sees injustice and wants to fight it. But sometimes good hearts make bad choices, Constance finished quietly. Eleanor turned, surprise flickering across her features. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Constance sat up straighter, ignoring the sharp protest from her ribs. You're afraid I'll ruin your family. And maybe I will, just by being here. The honesty seemed to steal Eleanor's breath. For a long moment, the two females studied each other across the elegant room on black. One white, one poor, one wealthy, one with nothing to lose, one with everything at stake. I don't want to hurt you, Eleanor said finally. Any of you. Then help me leave before I do. But even as the words left her mouth, Constance felt something tear inside her chest. This room, this kindness, this brief taste of safety, she wanted it with a hunger that frightened her. For 3 days, she'd allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. Dangerous thinking, she warned herself. That's how hearts get broken. Downstairs, Edmund's voice rose again, filled with a passion that made both women pause. I won't apologize for treating a human being like a human being. And if that ruins us, then we deserved ruining. The riders appeared at dawn like a dark omen against the red sky. 6 men on horseback approaching the Blackwood estate, with the grim purpose of a hanging party. Constance watched from behind the lace curtains as they dismounted, their spurs jingling like warning bells against the flagstone walkway. She recognized Harvey Morrison, immediately, his bulk and his swagger unmistakable even from a distance. Eleanor! Edmund's shout echoed through the house. Keep Constance upstairs, no matter what happens. But Constance was already moving, her bare feet silent on the Persian carpet as she crept to the top of the main staircase. The conversation below would determine her fate, and she refused to let others decide her future without hearing their words. Morrison's voice boomed through the foyer like thunder before a storm. Edmund, this madness ends today. You've had your fun playing savior, but reality has come calling. Harvey. Edmund's tone was ice-cold politeness. How unexpected, though I notice you brought quite an entourage for a social visit. Through the carved banister rails, Constance could see the men arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Morrison dominated the center, his silver hair gleaming despite the early hour, his expensive suit announcing his status to anyone with eye. Behind him stood Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man whose loyalty was measured in dollars rather than justice. The other 4 were Morrison's hired handsmen, whose faces bore the hard lines of those who asked few questions and expected ready payment. This isn't a social call, Morrison announced, pulling a folded document from his vest pocket. I have here a legal claim of ownership, properly signed and witnessed, for one female slave named Constance, age approximately 16, belonging to Thomas Henley of Henley Plantation. Eleanor gasped from somewhere in the parlor doorway. Edmund? But Edmund's attention was fixed on Morrison with laser intensity. Strange. Last I heard, Henley declared her worthless and abandoned her to die. Funny how property becomes valuable again once someone else shows it kindness. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his gun belt. Now, Mayor, you know I respect you, but the law is the law. That girl belongs to Henley, and harboring stolen property is a serious charge. Stolen? Edmund's laugh held no humor. I rescued a dying child from the roadside. If that's theft, then arrest me." Constance gripped the banister until her knuckles went white. She'd known this moment would come, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like watching an execution. The Blackwoods had risked everything for her, and now they would lose everything because of her. Morrison stepped closer to Edmund, lowering his voice but not enough to escape Constance's sharp ears. "You're forcing my hand here, old friend. I've got nothing personal against the girl, but this kind of bleeding heart nonsense threatens the stability of our entire way of life. Today it's one girl, tomorrow it's 10. Next month, who knows? Our way of life?" Edmund's voice carried genuine puzzlement. "You mean the way of life that treats human beings like livestock?" "I mean the way of life that keeps this town prosperous, keeps food on tables, keeps order in a world that desperately needs it." Morrison's patience was wearing thin. "You think you're being noble, but you're being selfish. Your conscience isn't worth more than everyone else's security." From her hidden position, Constance could see the truth in Morrison's words, even if she hated it. Her presence here was a crack in the foundation of everything these men had built their lives upon. She was living proof that their system could be questioned, challenged, overcome. "There's another way to resolve this," Sheriff Bradley offered, his voice uncertain. "The girl could, well, she could have an accident. Fall down some stairs, maybe catch a fever. Nobody would ask too many questions." The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Constance felt her blood turn to ice water. These men, respectable citizens, churchgoers, community leaders, were casually discussing her murder as if it were a business transaction. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath echoed from the parlor. "My God, Tom, listen to yourself." But Edmund's response surprised everyone, including Constance. He began to laugh, a rich, genuine sound that seemed completely out of place in the tense confrontation. "Harvey, Tom, gentlemen," he said, wiping his eyes, "I want to thank you. You've just solved a problem I've been wrestling with for weeks." Morrison's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What are you talking about?" "I've been wondering what kind of man I am, what kind of legacy I want to leave behind." Edmund's voice turned serious, almost conversational. "See, I got some news from my doctor recently. Consumption. 6 months, maybe a year if I'm careful." The announcement hit the room like a physical blow. Eleanor's soft sob drifted from the parlor. Even Morrison's hard expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. "Edmund, I'm sorry I didn't know," Morrison began. "Of course you didn't. But here's what I've realized. Standing here listening to you threaten an innocent girl's life." Edmund straightened to his full height. And suddenly he looked less like a dying man and more like a force of nature. "I'd rather spend my last months fighting for something I believe in than living comfortably with something I know is wrong." Sheriff Bradley's hand moved closer to his gun. "Mayor, you're not thinking clearly. The fever, the medicine sometimes, they affect a man's judgment." "My judgment has never been clearer," Edmund smiled, and there was something almost peaceful about his expression. "I'm not giving her up. Not today, not ever. If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 6 armed men against one sick mayor and his terrified wife. The math was simple, the outcome inevitable. But Constance had heard enough. The floorboards creaked like breaking bones as Constance descended the grand staircase, each step echoing through the foyer like a funeral bell. Every eye in the room turned toward her 6 men, who held her fate in their calloused hands. One woman whose kindness had become her burden, and one dying mayor whose courage might cost him everything. "I can speak for myself," Constance announced, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade through silk. The purple bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green, but her spine was straight as a church steeple. Her chin lifted with the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought or beaten out of someone. Morrison's face twisted with surprise and irritation. "Girl, this doesn't concern you. Go back upstairs where you belong." "Doesn't concern me?" Constance stepped onto the marble floor, her bare feet making no sound. "You're talking about my life, my future, my death. If that doesn't concern me, then nothing does." Sheriff Bradley's hand moved to his gun, but something in Constance's manner made him hesitate. She wasn't cowering or pleading. She wasn't running or hiding. She was facing them head-on with a fearlessness that seemed to light up the room. "You want to know about property?" Constance continued, moving closer to Morrison until she stood within arm's reach of the most powerful man in Cedar Springs. "Let me tell you what I've learned about being someone else's property." Edmund started to intervene, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. Something in her expression suggested she understood what Constance was doing and why it needed to happen. "I've been bought, sold, traded, and discarded," Constance said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been beaten for speaking, whipped for thinking, and starved for daring to dream. I've watched my mother torn away screaming, and my friends disappear into the night. I know what it means to be property." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Then you know your place." "No, sir. I know their place." Constance's eyes swept across the assembled men. "I know what kind of men need to own other people to feel powerful. What kind of men need laws and guns and sheriff's badges to make girls like me stay quiet." "Careful, girl," one of Morrison's hired hands growled. "You're walking on dangerous ground." But Constance was no longer afraid. Something had crystallized inside her during those long nights in the Blackwood guest room, something that had been building since the moment she'd refused to die face down in the dirt. "Dangerous ground?" She laughed, and the sound held notes of steel and starlight. "Mister, I've been walking on dangerous ground my whole life. The difference is, now I know which direction I'm heading." She turned to Sheriff Bradley, studying his weathered face with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "You're going to arrest me for being stolen property. But what law says I can't choose who owns me?" "That's not how it works," Bradley muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" Constance pressed. "If I'm property, and property gets bought and sold, then why can't I sell myself to someone who treats me well, instead of someone who leaves me to die?" The question hung in the air like incense, sweet and choking. Morrison's face was turning red with frustration. "Because that's not how the world works, girl. There are rules, laws, proper ways of doing things." "Whose rules?" Constance asked quietly. "Who made the laws that say some people can own other people? Who decided what the proper way of doing things should be?" "God," Morrison exploded. "God made the natural order, put people in their rightful places, gave us—" "God?" Constance's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire foyer. "You think God wants children beaten and left to die? You think God smiles when families get torn apart and sold to different states? You think God's plan includes growing rich from other people's pain?" Eleanor stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "She's right, Harvey. Whatever laws men have made, they don't come from God." "Eleanor, stay out of this," Morrison warned. But Eleanor Blackwood was discovering her own courage. "No, Harvey, I won't stay out of this. I've watched you and men like you use God's name to justify cruelty for too long. This ends here." Morrison spun on Edmund, his patience finally exhausted. "Control your wife, Blackwood." Edmund's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Harvey, you've known Eleanor for 20 years. Has she ever been controllable?" The absurdity of the situation was starting to dawn on everyone present. Here they were, 6 armed men, a sheriff with legal authority, and the most powerful businessman in 3 counties being challenged by a dying mayor, his previously silent wife, and a teenage girl who owned nothing but the torn dress on her back. "This is ridiculous," one of Morrison's men muttered. "Let's just take her and be done with it." But as he stepped toward Constance, something remarkable happened. Edmund moved to stand beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Eleanor joined them, her silk morning dress rustling as she took her place. 3 people facing 6, but somehow the odds felt different now. "If you want her," Edmund said quietly, "you'll have to take all of us." Morrison stared at the unlikely trio, his mind calculating odds and consequences. Taking the girl by force was one thing, rough justice for stolen property. But assaulting the mayor and his wife would bring down attention from Austin, maybe even Washington. The political cost could destroy him. "You're making a mistake, Edmund," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This won't end here. There are bigger forces at work than one small-town mayor and his misguided conscience." What kind of bigger forces? Constance asked, but something in Morrison's expression made her stomach clench with new fear. Morrison smiled, and it was the coldest thing anyone in that room had ever seen. The kind that reach all the way to the state capitol, girl. The kind that can make even mayors disappear when they become inconvenient. The morning sun painted the Blackwood parlor in shades of gold and amber as Constance sat across from Edmund and Eleanor, a leather-bound book open on the mahogany table between them. 3 days had passed since Morrison's chilling threat, 3 days of watching shadows and jumping at every sound, but today felt different, charged with possibility instead of fear. "Read it again," Edmund encouraged, his voice warm with pride as Constance stumbled through a particularly difficult passage about westward expansion and territorial rights. "The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities." Constance paused, sounding out the unfamiliar words with careful precision. The text swam before her eyes, but she pressed on, determined to master every syllable. Edmund coughed into his handkerchief, the sound wet and thick. The consumption was advancing faster than anyone wanted to admit, but he refused to waste time resting when there was so much work to do. "Edmund, perhaps we should take a break," Eleanor suggested, noting the gray tinge to her husband's complexion. But Constance was already shaking her head. "No, please, I need to understand this. If I'm going to survive in the world, I need to know how it works." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Here was a girl who, according to law, couldn't own property, couldn't vote, couldn't even legally learn to read. She was studying the Constitution with the intensity of a scholar, preparing for examinations. "Why is this so important to you?" Eleanor asked, watching Constance trace the words with her finger. Constance looked up, her eyes bright with purpose. "Because knowledge is the one thing they can't take away from me. They can steal my labor, sell my body, even kill me, but they can't reach inside my mind and steal what I've learned." A soft knock interrupted their impromptu lesson. Pike, the driver, appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and worry creasing his weathered features. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is William Garrison, from the American Anti-Slavery Society up in Boston." Edmund and Eleanor exchanged glances. They'd sent letters north weeks ago, desperate appeals to anyone who might offer legal advice or political protection. But they hadn't expected anyone to actually come. "Show him in, Pike." The man who entered the parlor was nothing like what Constance had expected from his impressive title. William Garrison was barely older than Edmund, with thinning brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. But his eyes held the fierce intelligence of someone who'd spent years fighting battles most people were afraid to acknowledge. "Mayor Blackwood?" Garrison extended his hand with a firm grip. "I came as soon as I received your letter. This young lady must be Constance." Constance rose from her chair, uncertain of the proper protocol. Should she curtsy? Shake hands? Hide upstairs while the adults discussed her future? Garrison solved the problem by approaching her directly. "Miss Constance, I've heard remarkable things about your courage. It's an honor to meet you." The simple respect in his voice, speaking to her as an equal rather than a problem to be solved, made Constance's throat tight with unexpected emotion. "What exactly did you hear?" she asked, finding her voice. Garrison's smile was both sad and proud. "I heard about a young woman who faced down 6 armed men with nothing but her own dignity. I heard about someone who refused to let the world define her worth." He paused, studying her with keen attention. "I also heard you've been teaching yourself to read." "The mayor and his wife have been helping me," Constance corrected quickly. "But the desire came from you." Garrison pulled a slim volume from his travel bag. "I brought you something. It's a collection of poems by Phyllis Wheatley, a woman who knew something about finding light in dark places." Constance accepted the book with reverent hands. The leather cover was worn smooth by countless readings, and when she opened it, the pages released the scent of ink and dreams. "There's more," Garrison continued, his attention turning to Edmund. "I've been in correspondence with my colleagues in San Antonio. There's a Quaker family there, the Millers, who run a school for freed women and girls of color. They're prepared to offer Constance not just sanctuary, but education. Real education." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her heart. Edmund leaned forward with sudden intensity, but Constance just stared at the book in her hands, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "You mean I could really learn?" she whispered. "Everything. Reading, writing, mathematics, history." "Everything," Garrison confirmed. "But there's a condition. The journey to San Antonio is dangerous, especially for someone in your position. And once you leave Cedar Springs, you can never come back. This would be a permanent farewell to everything you've known." Constance looked around the parlor that had become her sanctuary, the crystal chandelier that threw rainbows across the walls, the Persian carpet that felt like clouds beneath her feet, the faces of the people who had risked everything to save her life. "What about them?" she asked, nodding toward the Blackwoods. "Morrison said there would be consequences. If I leave, will they be safe?" Edmund and Eleanor exchanged a long look, having one of those wordless conversations that long-married couples perfected. "Constance," Eleanor said softly, "we've been talking, and we've decided something. Whether you stay or go, we're leaving Cedar Springs." "What?" Constance felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Edmund coughed again, then set down his handkerchief with deliberate care. "I wrote my resignation letter this morning. Eleanor has family in California. Her brother owns orchards near Sacramento. We're going west, where the air might be better for my lungs and the attitudes might be better for our consciences." "But this is your home," Constance protested. "Your whole life is here." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Our whole life is what we make of it, and we've decided we want to make something better." Garrison watched this exchange with growing respect. "There's something else you should know. I've brought legal papers, documents that could help protect you, regardless of what you decide. But signing them would mean taking a new name, accepting a new identity. Constance would cease to exist, legally speaking." The weight of the decision settled on Constance's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She could stay Constance, forever marked, forever hunted, forever looking over her shoulder. Or she could become someone new, someone with the chance to shape her own destiny. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "The wagon train leaves for San Antonio tomorrow morning," Garrison replied gently. "I'm sorry, but we can't risk waiting longer." Constance nodded, understanding. In the distance, church bells were chiming the noon hour, marking time in a world that suddenly felt full of infinite possibility. She opened the poetry book and read the first lines her eyes found. "Through thickest gloom look back, immortal shade, on that confusion which thy death has made." Death and rebirth, she thought. Sometimes you have to die to who you were to become who you're meant to be.